Hey there, you looking kinda cute. Please consider subscribing and check out our Patreon for more. Enjoy the video. A manicured hand reached for the crystal tumbler, ice cubes clinking against glass as they swirled in amber liquid. The hand paused, its owner noting the slender fingers and smooth skin with a mixture of fascination and unease. Roy exhaled slowly, his breath catching as he studied his reflection in the office window. The face staring back at him was undeniably feminine, high cheekbones, full lips, and almond-shaped eyes framed by long lashes. It was a far cry from the rugged, masculine features he'd sported just weeks ago. "Mr. Harrison, your 10 o'clock is here." Cindy's voice crackled through the intercom, startling Roy from his reverie. He smoothed down his skirt, still an unfamiliar sensation, and cleared his throat. "Send them in," he replied, wincing at the softness of his voice. Gone was the deep baritone that had commanded boardrooms and intimidated subordinates. In its place was a lilting soprano that still felt foreign on his tongue. The door swung open, revealing a middle-aged man in an ill-fitting suit. His eyes widened as they fell on Roy, confusion etched across his face. "I'm sorry, I must have the wrong office. I'm looking for Roy Harrison." Roy forced a smile, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "You're in the right place, Mr. Johnson. Please, have a seat." The man hesitated, his gaze darting between Roy and the nameplate on the desk. "But I don't understand. You're not—" "I assure you, I am Roy Harrison," Roy interrupted, his tone brooking no argument despite its newfound musicality. "Now, shall we discuss the Pearson account, or would you prefer to waste more time gawking?" Mr. Johnson flushed, mumbling an apology as he sank into the chair. Roy launched into his presentation, pushing aside the nagging voice in his head that whispered of the absurdity of the situation. He was still Roy Harrison, Executive Vice President of Marketing, regardless of his altered appearance. The sooner everyone accepted that, the better. As the meeting drew to a close, Roy caught a glimpse of Cindy through the open door. Her eyes met his, a mix of concern and curiosity evident in her gaze. He felt a familiar flutter in his chest, the same one he'd experienced countless times before when looking at her. But now that feeling was tinged with something new. Envy? Admiration? He couldn't quite put his finger on it. Mr. Johnson gathered his papers, still visibly uncomfortable. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Harrison, I'll have my team review your proposals and get back to you by week's end." Roy nodded, rising to shake the man's hand. He noted with some amusement how Mr. Johnson's eyes darted to his chest, then quickly away, a flush creeping up his neck. As the door closed behind his client, Roy slumped back into his chair, exhaustion washing over him. He reached for his tumbler, only to find it empty. With a sigh, he pressed the intercom button. "Cindy, could you bring me a refill, and perhaps we could talk?" There was a pause before Cindy's voice came through, hesitant but warm. "Of course, Mr. Harrison. I'll be right in." Moments later, Cindy entered, a fresh drink in hand. She set it on the desk, then hovered uncertainly, her eyes roaming over Roy's transformed features. "Please sit," Roy said, gesturing to the chair Mr. Johnson had recently vacated. "I imagine you have questions." Cindy perched on the edge of the seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Mr. Harrison, I don't mean to pry, but what's happening? Are you all right?" Roy laughed, a bitter sound that held no humor. "All right? I'm not sure I even know what that means anymore." He ran a hand through his hair, now falling in soft waves past his shoulders. "I don't understand it myself, Cindy. One day I was me. And then, little by little, I started changing. At first, it was small things, losing body hair, my skin becoming softer. I thought maybe it was stress or some bizarre medical condition, but then—" He trailed off, gesturing to his body with a sweep of his hand. Cindy's eyes followed the movement, taking in the curves now evident beneath Roy's tailored blouse. "It's remarkable," Cindy murmured, then blushed. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" "It's all right," Roy interrupted, a wry smile tugging at his lips. I suppose remarkable is one way to put it. Terrifying and impossible are a few others that come to mind. Cindy leaned forward, her expression earnest. Have you seen a doctor? Surely there must be some explanation, some way to reverse this? Roy shook his head, reaching for his drink. I've been to every specialist in the city. They're baffled. As far as they can tell, I'm a perfectly healthy woman in her mid-30s. There's no medical reason for my transformation, no treatment to undo it. He took a long sip, savoring the burn of the alcohol. So, here I am, trying to navigate a world that suddenly sees me very differently, while inside I'm still me. Cindy was quiet for a moment, her brow furrowed in thought. You know, she said slowly, I always admired your confidence, Mr. Harrison. The way you commanded a room, how sure you were of yourself. I can see that hasn't changed, even if your appearance has. Roy blinked, surprised by the compliment. He'd always thought Cindy viewed him with a mixture of fear and disdain, like so many others in the office. Thank you, he said softly. I'm not sure I feel very confident these days, but I'm trying. Well, you're doing a remarkable job, Cindy replied, a small smile playing on her lips. I don't think I'd handle such a drastic change half as well as you are. Roy felt a warmth spread through his chest, one that had nothing to do with the whiskey. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could navigate this new reality. Cindy, he began, then paused, unsure how to continue. I know I haven't always been the easiest person to work with. I've said and done things that were inappropriate, and I'm sorry for that. This experience has been eye-opening in more ways than one. Cindy's smile widened, a hint of mischief in her eyes. Well, Mr. Harrison, they do say walking a mile in someone else's shoes can change a person's perspective, though in your case, I suppose it's more like walking a mile in someone else's body. Roy couldn't help but laugh, the sound light and musical. I suppose you're right. And please, call me Roy. I think we're a bit past formalities at this point. All right. Roy, Cindy said, testing out the name. So, what's next? How do you plan to handle this situation with the rest of the office, with clients? Roy sighed, running a hand through his hair again, a habit he'd picked up since the transformation began. I'm not sure. I've been trying to keep it under wraps as much as possible, but that's becoming increasingly difficult. I suppose I'll have to make some sort of announcement, explain the situation as best I can. And what about your personal life? Cindy asked gently. Your family friends? Roy's expression darkened. My parents passed away years ago, and I don't have any siblings. As for friends, he trailed off, realizing with a pang how few true friends he actually had. His social circle had always revolved around work and casual acquaintances, most of whom he'd kept at arm's length. I suppose I'll cross that bridge when I come to it. Cindy reached out, hesitating for a moment before placing her hand on Roy's. The touch sent a jolt through him, both familiar and entirely new. You don't have to face this alone, you know. I'm here if you need someone to talk to or, well, anything, really. Roy looked at their hands, then up at Cindy's face. He saw genuine concern there and something else, a warmth he'd never noticed before. Or perhaps he'd simply never allowed himself to see it. Thank you, Cindy, he said softly. That means more than you know. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the air between them charged with unspoken possibilities. Finally, Cindy withdrew her hand, standing up with a small cough. Well, I should get back to work. Those emails won't answer themselves. Roy nodded, feeling an odd sense of loss as she moved away. Of course. And Cindy? Thank you again. For everything. She paused at the door, looking back with a smile that made Roy's heart skip a beat. Anytime, Roy. Remember, my door is always open. As the door closed behind her, Roy leaned back in his chair, his mind whirling. He glanced down at his body, taking in the curves and contours that still felt so alien. For the first time since this bizarre transformation began, he felt a glimmer of acceptance. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of the world. maybe it was the beginning of something new. With a deep breath, Roy stood up, smoothing down his skirt. He had work to do, a company to run, and a new life to figure out. One step at a time, he told himself. One day at a time. He opened his office door, stepping out into the bustling workspace. Heads turned, whispers erupted, but Roy held his chin high. He was still Roy Harrison, damn it, no matter what form he took. And he had a job to do. "All right, everyone," he called out, his soprano voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. "I know you all have questions, and I promise we'll address them soon. But right now, we have deadlines to meet and clients to impress. So let's get to it, shall we?" For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, the office came back to life. Phones rang, keyboards clacked, and the low hum of conversation resumed. Roy caught Cindy's eye across the room, and she gave him a thumbs up and an encouraging smile. As he walked back to his office, Roy felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in weeks, he felt ready to face it head-on. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and endless explanations. Roy had decided to tackle the situation head-on, calling an all-staff meeting to address his transformation. The reactions ranged from shocked disbelief to cautious acceptance, with a few individuals struggling to hide their amusement or disdain. Through it all, Cindy remained a steadfast ally. She fielded calls from curious clients, deflected intrusive questions from gossip-hungry coworkers, and provided a listening ear when Roy needed to vent his frustrations. It was Friday evening, and Roy found himself lingering in the office long after most of the staff had left for the weekend. He stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker to life as dusk settled over the skyline. The reflection in the glass showed a woman he was slowly beginning to recognize. Not quite the Roy of old, but no longer a complete stranger either. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his reverie. "Come in," he called, turning to see Cindy step into the office. "I thought you might still be here," she said, a gentle smile on her face. "How are you holding up?" Roy sighed, running a hand through his hair, a habit he still hadn't shaken. "Honestly, I'm exhausted, but also relieved, in a way. At least now everything's out in the open." Cindy nodded, moving to stand beside him at the window. "You've handled it all remarkably well. I'm impressed. I couldn't have done it without you," Roy said softly, turning to face her. "Your support has meant everything to me, Cindy." Their eyes met, and Roy felt that familiar flutter in his chest. But this time, it was accompanied by a new sensation, a warmth that spread through his body, igniting nerves he never knew he had. Cindy's gaze dropped to Roy's lips, then back up to his eyes. "Roy, she began, then hesitated. "What is it?" Roy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've always admired you," Cindy confessed, her cheeks flushing. "Your drive, your intelligence. But I never thought... before all this happened, you never seemed to see me as anything more than a secretary." Roy felt a pang of guilt, remembering his past behavior. "I was blind," he said, reaching out to take Cindy's hand. "And foolish. I'm sorry it took all of this for me to see what was right in front of me." Cindy's fingers intertwined with his, sending a shiver down Roy's spine. "And now?" she asked, her voice husky. "What do you see?" Roy swallowed hard, his heart pounding. "I see you, Cindy, really see you, and I think I'm falling for you." The words hung in the air between them, charged with possibility. Then, slowly, Cindy leaned in. Roy met her halfway, their lips coming together in a soft, tentative kiss. It was unlike anything Roy had ever experienced. The softness of Cindy's lips, the gentle pressure of her hand on his waist, the way his body responded with a surge of heat and desire. It was all new, all exhilarating. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. Cindy's eyes were wide, a mix of wonder and desire swirling in their depths. "Wow," she whispered, Roy couldn't help but laugh, the sound light and joyous. "Wow, indeed," he agreed, reaching up to tuck a strand of hair behind Cindy's ear. "So, what happens now?" Cindy asked, her hand still resting on Roy's waist. Roy took a deep breath, considering. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "This is all new territory for me, but I know I want to explore it. With you, if that's what you want to." Cindy's smile was radiant. "I'd like that very much," she said, leaning in for another kiss. As their lips met again, Roy felt a sense of peace wash over him. For the first time since his transformation began, he felt truly at home in his new body. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew he wouldn't face them alone. The kiss deepened, and Roy lost himself in the sensation. The office, the city beyond the window, the worries about the future, all of it faded away, leaving only this moment, this connection. When they finally parted, both were flushed and slightly disheveled. Roy couldn't help but chuckle at the sight of Cindy's smudged lipstick, reaching out to gently wipe it away with his thumb. "We should probably get out of here," he said, glancing at the clock. "It's getting late." Cindy nodded, smoothing down her blouse. "You're right. Though I have to admit I'm not quite ready for this evening to end." Roy felt a thrill of excitement at her words. "Neither am I," he confessed. "Would you like to get dinner? I know a little Italian place not far from here." Cindy's smile was answer enough. "I'd love to," she said, reaching for Roy's hand. "Lead the way." As they left the office, Roy caught sight of their reflection in the elevator doors. He barely recognized himself, not because of his changed appearance, but because of the joy radiating from his face. For the first time in weeks, he felt truly alive. The elevator dinged, doors sliding open to reveal the empty lobby. Hand in hand, Roy and Cindy stepped out into the night, ready to face whatever the future might hold. Together. The Italian restaurant was a cozy, dimly lit affair, tucked away on a quiet side street. Candlelight flickered across the red and white checkered tablecloths, casting a warm glow on Roy and Cindy's faces as they perused the menu. "I've never been here before," Cindy remarked, her eyes roaming over the handwritten specials board. "It's charming." Roy smiled, a hint of nostalgia in his voice. "I used to come here often, years ago. The owner, Giuseppe, is an old friend." As if summoned by the mention of his name, a portly man with a salt and pepper mustache appeared at their table, his face splitting into a wide grin. "Roy, it's been too long, my friend." He paused, his brow furrowing as he took in Roy's altered appearance. Forgive me, but..." Roy held up a hand, his smile tinged with resignation. "It's a long story, Giuseppe, but yes, it's me." Giuseppe's eyes widened, then softened with understanding. Life is full of surprises, no? But you are still Roy, and you are always welcome here." He turned to Cindy, giving her a theatrical bow. "And who is this lovely lady?" "This is Cindy," Roy introduced, feeling a warmth spread through his chest as he said her name. "My date," Cindy blushed, extending her hand to Giuseppe. "It's a pleasure to meet you." "The pleasure is all mine," Giuseppe declared, kissing her hand with a flourish. "Any friend of Roy's is family here. Now, what can I get for you two lovebirds?" As Giuseppe took their orders and bustled away, Roy and Cindy fell into easy conversation. They talked about work, shared childhood memories, and swapped stories about their most disastrous dates. Roy found himself laughing more than he had in months, maybe years. "You know," Cindy said, twirling pasta around her fork, "I always wondered what you were like outside the office. You were so intimidating at work." Roy winced, remembering his past behavior. "I was a bit of a tyrant, wasn't I?" Cindy reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "You were driven, focused, but I always sensed there was more to you than that hard-ass exterior." "And now?" Roy asked, his voice soft. "What do you see?" Cindy's gaze was warm, her thumb tracing circles on Roy's palm. "I see someone strong, someone who's faced an impossible situation with grace and courage. I see you, Roy. Just you. Roy felt his eyes prick with tears, overwhelmed by the acceptance in Cindy's words. He blinked them away, squeezing her hand in return. The rest of the meal passed in a blur of good food, better wine, and conversation that flowed as easily as the Chianti. As Giuseppe cleared their plates, Roy found himself reluctant for the evening to end. "Would you like to take a walk?" he asked Cindy, nodding towards the door. "It's a beautiful night." Cindy's smile was answer enough. They bid goodbye to Giuseppe, who sent them off with kisses on both cheeks and a bottle of wine for later. The night air was crisp, carrying the first hints of autumn. Roy offered Cindy his arm, and she took it, nestling close as they strolled down the quiet street. "This has been wonderful," Cindy murmured, her head resting on Roy's shoulder. "I never imagined," Roy chuckled, "that you'd be on a date with your boss, who happened to transform into a woman?" Cindy laughed, the sound light and musical. "When you put it like that, it does sound rather absurd. But I meant, I never imagined I could feel this way. About anyone." They stopped walking, turning to face each other. Roy reached up, cupping Cindy's face in his hand. "I know what you mean," he said softly. "This is all new to me, but it feels right." Cindy leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. "Roy," she whispered, "I'd really like to kiss you again." Roy didn't need to be asked twice. He closed the distance between them, capturing Cindy's lips in a kiss that started soft but quickly deepened. He felt her hands on his waist, pulling him closer, and he melted into the embrace. When they finally parted, both were breathless. Roy rested his forehead against Cindy's, his heart pounding. "Wow," Cindy breathed, echoing their earlier sentiment in the office. Roy laughed, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. "Wow, indeed." They resumed their walk, hand in hand this time. The city bustled around them, but Roy felt cocooned in a bubble of contentment. "So," Cindy said after a while, a hint of mischief in her voice, "what's it like? Being a woman, I mean." Roy considered the question, tilting his head thoughtfully. "It's strange, wonderful, and terrifying in equal measure. Everything feels different, the way clothes fit, the way people look at me, the way I move through the world. But at the same time, I'm still me, just a different version of me." Cindy nodded, her expression understanding. "It must be overwhelming at times." "It is," Roy admitted, "but moments like this, they make it feel less scary, less lonely." They walked in companionable silence for a while, eventually finding themselves in a small park. Roy led Cindy to a bench overlooking a fountain, its waters sparkling in the moonlight. As they sat, Cindy turned to Roy, her expression serious. "Can I ask you something?" Roy nodded, feeling a flutter of nervousness. "Of course. Do you want to change back? If you could?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Roy took a deep breath, considering his answer carefully. "I don't know," he said finally. "A week ago, I would have said yes without hesitation, but now—" He trailed off, looking down at their intertwined hands. "Now, I'm not so sure. This change has forced me to confront parts of myself I'd been ignoring for years. It's opened my eyes to so much, and it's brought me closer to you." Cindy squeezed his hand, her voice soft. "But it's also turned your life upside down, changed how the world sees you, how you see yourself." Roy nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "It has, and I'd be lying if I said it wasn't difficult, but—" He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But I think maybe this is who I was always meant to be. Does that sound crazy?" Cindy shook her head, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Not at all. It sounds brave. And true." Roy felt something shift inside him at her words, a sense of acceptance settling over him like a warm blanket. He leaned in, kissing Cindy softly. "Thank you," he murmured against her lips, "for seeing me. All of me." Cindy smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Roy's face. "Always," she promised. They sat there for a long time, talking softly, sharing kisses, and watching the moon rise over the city skyline. As the night grew cooler, Roy felt Cindy shiver beside him. "We should probably head back," he said, reluctantly standing and offering Cindy his hand. "It's getting late." Cindy took his hand, but didn't move to stand. Instead, she looked up at Roy, her expression a mix of nervousness and desire. "Or we could go back to my place. If you want to, I mean. No pressure." Roy felt a thrill of excitement mixed with a touch of anxiety. This would be another first, another step into uncharted territory. But looking at Cindy, her face open and full of affection, he knew his answer. "I'd like that," he said softly, pulling her to her feet and into his arms. "I'd like that very much." As they left the park, walking close together to ward off the chill, Roy felt a sense of peace wash over him. He didn't know what the future held, if his transformation was permanent, how the world would continue to react, or what challenges lay ahead, but he knew he wouldn't face them alone. With Cindy by his side, Roy felt ready to embrace this new chapter of his life, whatever it might bring. As they hailed a cab, exchanging shy smiles and gentle touches, Roy realized that for the first time since his transformation began, he felt truly, completely himself. The cab pulled away from the curb, carrying them towards Cindy's apartment and the promise of a new beginning. Roy looked out at the city rushing by, his reflection in the window showing a face that was becoming more familiar by the day. He smiled, sweetly Cindy's hand. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. And that, Roy realized, was all that really mattered. Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out Patreon for a lot more content and early access to YouTube videos.